Welcome to multi-instance clustering. When setting up a multi-instance cluster, it's fairly straightforward. There's a few simple rules to keep in mind, and once you've got those down, it's basically just a matter of running clustered SQL Server instances as independent objects within the same cluster. The instances are going to be completely unaware of each other. They have no way to talk to each other, no way to manage each other's resources, just like in a traditional standalone SQL Server configuration where you've got multiple instances installed on one physical box. Now, this is a little bit different in a cluster because each instance is going to have its own host name. I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. Do remember, installing multiple instances on a single SQL Server cluster requires that you install SQL Server lots and lots of times. This is because you have to have one installation per instance per cluster node. So imagine, for example, we have a 16-node cluster running Windows 2012 Data Center Edition, and we're installing SQL Server 2012 Enterprise Edition on top of that. We want to configure our cluster so that each instance can run on any of the nodes at any time. We're going to install all 15 nodes on all 16 servers, leaving one server as a hot standby in the event that we need to reboot or fail one of our physical servers. To do this requires installing SQL Server 240 times. That's because we need to do 15 installations for each one of our 16 servers, because we need to get all 15 instances on all 16 machines. That way the instances can float from one physical server to another as they need to as we're rebooting our various servers. When installing multiple instances of SQL Server on a single cluster, keep in mind that each instance is going to have its own network name, its own instance name, its own IP address, and its own shared disk drive. Assume that you're using SAN drives. The reason each instance has to have its own network name is because there's no guarantee that multiple instances are going to be running on the same physical host. Each instance goes in its own resource group, and therefore each instance can float from one physical server to another as necessary. Because the instances can all move from one physical server to another without really any care that they're on the same physical box as another one, we can't rely on them having the same network name, because the network names are tied to IP addresses, and IP addresses can only exist on one physical box at a time. The instances each have to have their own instance name as well, because we can't name the services all MS SQL Server. We have to have separate services installed on each box. Now, this doesn't mean the end users need to connect using an instance name. You can set each one of these instances to listen on port 1433. The reason this works is because each instance has its own IP address, and the instance is configured by default to only listen on that one specific IP address. So since we set up each instance to listen on port 1433, we can simply connect on port 1433 on each of those network names and IP addresses, and as far as our end users are concerned, every instance is a default instance. But in reality, the instances actually are named instances. We have to have a dedicated shared disk drive for each instance for much the same reason we have to have a dedicated network name for each instance. Because the shared drive is only going to be owned by any one node in the cluster at any one time, we have to keep that shared drive for just that one instance, because we can never guarantee that multiple instances are going to be running on the same box. You might be asking yourself, can't I just drop multiple instances into the same resource group after SQL Server is done and being installed? Technically, yes, you could, but this would be an unsupported configuration.